We're continuing our video series for BA 310, Ethics in the Workplace. And this chapter really goes over some of the more general workplace issues as far as ethics and morals in the workplace. And the first question that the chapter really highlights, questions us, is, do you lose your civil liberties at work? And it's interesting bringing this up in a classroom because generally there's two sides. One who thinks, no, of course you don't, you always have your civil liberties, and the other that thinks more that you forgo every civil liberty that you could possibly have in the workplace. And of course the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that. And we'll take a look at free speech. And because that's the one that probably comes up the most in business environments. And we've seen over the past couple of years employees or professional athletes that maybe feel like they should have free speech at work, and I would argue that they do have free speech at work. It's just that there are consequences to our free speech, particularly at work, but I would even argue beyond work. That yes, you have the right to free speech, but the business has also the right to take action against you if they disagree with what you say. And we see this not only just in work environments, but also with social media, that businesses have looked at and questioned employee social media posts. In the higher education environment, high school students have lost scholarships based on what they're posting on social media. Again, it's not that it is against the law that you have free speech and you have the right to say whatever you want both at work as well as in social media. It's just that there might be consequences to that free speech. The other big one at work is this right of unreasonable search and seizure. And this one might be a little more nuanced, I guess, in that obviously a business doesn't have the right to strip search their employees or something like that. However, the business does have the right to search your computer, actually to search their computer. In addition to that, something that people don't really think of a lot is if you are logged on to the company network, their Wi-Fi, even though it's your equipment, whatever you're texting, calling, posting, whatever, it's going through the company's network. And the company has the ability, and they probably do not track, but they probably do save all the information going across their network. So they have it, and if something does come up with an employee, they have the ability to go back and pull all the text messages and things like that went through their network. So while it is an interesting thing with unreasonable search and seizure, because again, they're only searching either their equipment, their laptop, their computer, or the things that you put through on their network. Again, if you're not using their Wi-Fi, then they don't see what's going through on your phone. The next item that this chapter highlights is this idea of employment at will. And most people look at employment at will from the company's perspective. But there are two sides of it that we're going to highlight right now. The company's perspective, which again is the part that everybody generally highlights, is that a company can fire you for good cause, no cause, or even a morally wrong cause. And that was the language from the Supreme Court. So, and again, this is why many managers, if they are firing an employee, they come back with, well, you know, why am I being fired? And the manager answers, well, I don't have to answer that, I can fire you for any cause I want or no cause at all. Again, that's true, but it's also a pretty poor manager that won't give a reason, and sometimes the manager doesn't give a reason because what they're firing you for is a morally wrong reason, or they really don't have a reason. Personally, I've never done that before, because if I'm going to let an employee go, there's a good reason for it, and I'm going to tell the employee exactly why they're being let go. And as a manager, and I think it is the right thing to do, the morally correct thing to do, to inform you. Again, you might not agree with me, but at least I'm telling you why I'm letting you go. Now there is that other side of it, and while the business can let you go for no reason, any reason, the same thing is true under employment at will for the employees, that they can take the job, resign from the job for good cause, no cause, or even a morally wrong cause. So employment at will really works both ways in this. It works for the employee and it works for the employer on that. Now there are some restrictions to employment at will. In other words, while employment at will says that you can fire an employee for good cause, no cause, or even a morally wrong cause, there are several laws that protect the employee and reasons you can't fire an employee for. And the first one that we're going to go over is the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act says that employers can't fire an employee for union activity. And this could be taking part in a strike or handing out pamphlets or whatever. But again, you can fire a union employee, you just can't fire a union employee for taking part in union activities. The next one, which is probably the most popular that everybody knows, is the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act says that you can't fire somebody based on their race, religion, nationality, or gender. And while that's what the law says, I'm not here to tell you that those things don't exist. It is against the law to do it, but I do think, bigotry does exist. And in many cases, there's really no way to catch somebody. I do think a lot of bigotry, especially revolving around the Civil Rights Act, is involved even before you get an interview, that an employer can limit based on, some of those are harder, like obviously religion is a hard one to tell based on the resume. Sometimes race is a difficult thing, but if that's what you wanted to do, anybody with any kind of ethnic name or a last name that is particular to a certain nationality, a Hispanic name or a Jewish last name or something like that, that I do think some bigotry probably does exist in that we're not even going to interview these people. Certainly, you can tell with some, depending on what the name is, what a person's gender is. But I do think that while, yes, it's illegal, that I do think some bigotry probably does exist in those areas. Nationality is a little bit harder to tell on a resume, as well as religion, but all four of those things are restricted by law, that you cannot discriminate against somebody based on those things. The next one, which unfortunately the chapter kind of adds age into the Civil Rights Act. In effect, in reality, it was a separate act. So we do have the Age Discrimination Act, that you can't discriminate against somebody based on age. However, you can, based on age, if it's a younger person. It's really that you can't discriminate against older workers. and the act says older is over 40. So the act restricts discrimination based on age being over 40. And the last one we're going to talk about in this video is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is probably the hardest one because it's not cut and dry like the rest of them are. So the Americans with Disabilities Act says that we can't discriminate against people with disabilities, assuming they can do the job, and requires the employer to make reasonable accommodations. And this is where it really gets into a gray area as what is considered reasonable. And the unfortunate thing is that much of it depends on the size of the company. That perhaps, putting in a ramp that costs a couple $100, I'm going to guess, is going to be considered a reasonable accommodation no matter what your company makes. Buying some software for a couple $100 is probably going to be considered a reasonable accommodation no matter the size of the company. I'm actually in the second floor room right now, and it is a building, an old building that doesn't have an elevator. Now, if I was renting this room for my company, and it was a company of 10 individuals, I'm gonna guess that a reasonable accommodation would not be to spend $1 million to put in an elevator in this older building. However, I think probably if this was a large multi-billion-dollar company, Microsoft, Apple, many of the car companies, things like that, that $1 million probably would be seen as a reasonable accommodation. So again, this one is a little bit more difficult, and a lot would depend on the size of the company and the profit that the company's making on, I think, what the court would decide as what is reasonable. So in this video, which is really part one of this chapter, we talked about civil liberties at work, employment at will, and these restrictions against employment at will, that you can fire an employee or discipline an employee for any reason, no reason, or even a morally wrong reason, except the Wagner Act for union activities, the Civil Rights Act based on race, creed, nationality, and gender, the Age Discrimination Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act.